Don't you ever touch him again? Jonathan Hayes's voice cracked like a whip across the room as he ripped Oliver from Evelyn's arms. The child's wail split the air, small fingers reaching for her, but Jonathan's glare burned hotter than the coastal sun. You're here to watch him, not hold him. Evelyn swallowed hard, steadying her breath. He only sleeps when he feels safe, she said quietly. And you're taking that away. The wind that morning carried the salt and bite of late autumn along the Maine coast, pushing in from the Atlantic and rattling the thin glass panes of the Hayes estate. The town of Camden lay quiet beneath a pale gray sky, the fishing boats in the harbor rocking gently against their moorings, their bells chiming like slow, reluctant thoughts. The estate itself, perched on a bluff above the water, was a sprawling Victorian mansion with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch. Inside, it smelled faintly of polished oak, lemon oil, and a kind of restrained wealth, the kind that didn't flaunt but never forgot to remind. Evelyn Brooks arrived at the front steps with a single suitcase and a canvas tote over her shoulder. She was 29, of medium height, with deep umber skin, high cheekbones, and eyes that held both warmth and a quiet watchfulness. Her black hair was pulled into a low, practical bun, though a loose strand at her temple betrayed a stubborn softness she never quite managed to hide. Life had taught her to be careful with people. Growing up the eldest of four in a cramped apartment in Baltimore had sharpened her patience and made her resilient. But children seemed to disarm her caution with a swiftness that surprised even her. She was here to work as a live-in nanny for Oliver Hayes, the 2-year-old son of Jonathan Hayes, a man whose reputation in Maine was a mixture of admiration and wariness. Jonathan appeared in the doorway when she knocked. Tall, broad-shouldered, and in his mid-30s, he wore a charcoal wool sweater and tailored slacks as though he had stepped directly out of a magazine spread for winter menswear. His hair, the color of wet sand, was swept back neatly, and his pale blue eyes were cool, almost assessing. Jonathan Hayes was the founder and CEO of Hayes Hospitality Group, a chain of boutique hotels along the eastern seaboard, known for his relentless work ethic and his ability to cut deals with the precision of a surgeon. Locals said he was polite in public, brusque in private, and entirely at ease in a boardroom, but ill at ease in his own kitchen. "You're punctual," he said, holding the door wider without smiling. "Oliver's upstairs." He led her up the main staircase to the attic nursery, a sunlit space with slanted ceilings and a view of the restless gray sea. Oliver sat in a padded corner of the room, a small, curly-haired boy with hazel eyes and the uncertain expression of someone still deciding whether to trust the world. He clutched a stuffed fox with one ear missing, watching Evelyn with cautious curiosity. His cheeks were pink from the chill that slipped through the drafty window frames. "This is Miss Brooks," Jonathan told his son, his tone clipped but not unkind. "She'll be helping out during the day." Evelyn crouched to Oliver's eye level, letting her voice soften. "Hi, Oliver. I like your fox." The boy blinked, then held it out to her for exactly 2 seconds, before hugging it back to his chest. She smiled, and in that instant she felt the first fragile thread of connection. The morning passed with quiet exploration, Evelyn learning where the bottles and formula were kept, Oliver learning that this new person in his house could stack blocks into towers without knocking them over right away. But just before nap time, Oliver began to fuss, rubbing his eyes and whimpering. Instinctively, Evelyn scooped him up, rocking him gently, humming an old lullaby her grandmother used to sing. The boy's breathing slowed, his head settling against her shoulder. That was when Jonathan stepped back into the room. His eyes flicked to the way Oliver's small hand had curled into the fabric of Evelyn's sweater. "That's not necessary," he said sharply. "Put him in the crib. He needs to learn." Evelyn kept her voice calm. "He's almost asleep. Just another minute." Jonathan's tone hardened. "Miss Brooks, you're here to care for him, not coddle him. You're the help, not his mother." He stepped forward, reaching to take Oliver from her arms. The movement jolted the boy awake, and his cry was immediate, sharp, and desperate. His little hands flailed toward her, searching for the anchor that had been pulled away. Jonathan, awkward in the act of holding him, patted his back with stiff, unfamiliar motions. "It's Daddy, son," he murmured, but Oliver only cried harder, his face flushed, breath hitching in ragged bursts. Evelyn straightened her shoulders, her voice low and even. "You're scaring him." For a long moment, the two adults faced each other, the child's cries filling the attic room. Something in Jonathan's gaze wavered, a crack in the frost. He looked at his son's tear-streaked face, then at the woman who had calmed him moments before. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he handed Oliver back. The boy buried his face against Evelyn's chest, his sobs quieting to hiccups. Jonathan said nothing more, only turned and left the room. Outside, the wind howled against the attic windows. Later that afternoon, after Oliver had finally fallen into a deep sleep, Evelyn decided to explore the grounds. She found the back garden overgrown with ivy, and edged by a low stone wall. Beyond it, an old shed crouched beneath a weathered maple tree. Its wood siding was gray with age, the padlock on its door newer and out of place. In front of the shed stood a German shepherd, large, with a thick coat that had once been black and tan, but was now softened by age into muted shades. A white cloth bandana was tied carefully over his eyes, the edges frayed but clean. His ears pricked at the sound of her steps, head turning toward her with a sense beyond sight. This was Duke, Mrs. Marjorie Clark, the housekeeper, a stout woman in her late 50s with a brisk walk and a fondness for keeping conversations short, had mentioned him in passing that morning. A retired search and rescue dog, now blind, left behind when his handler moved out of state. Duke stood with the stillness of a sentinel, his nose lifting to catch her scent. Evelyn approached slowly, crouching to offer her hand. He sniffed once, then pressed his head into her palm, with a sigh that seemed almost human. "You're a good boy," she whispered, and pulled a small biscuit from her tote, the kind she carried for stray animals. Duke took it gently, chewing with quiet dignity. She noticed how, after eating, he stepped toward the shed and paused there, facing the locked door, as though listening for something on the other side. The wind rustled the maple's bare branches, and Evelyn felt a faint prickle at the back of her neck. No one in the house had said anything about the shed. When she asked Mrs. Clark about it later, the woman only shrugged and changed the subject. As dusk fell, the tide crashed harder against the bluff below, and the sky darkened to the color of wet slate. In the attic nursery, Evelyn watched Oliver sleep, his breathing slow and steady. Somewhere in the garden, Duke gave a single, low bark, less a warning than a reminder that he was still there, keeping watch over something no one wished to name. The days after Evelyn's arrival were a slow unwinding of the taut, invisible threads that bound the Hayes household. Outside, winter's edge pressed closer, the Atlantic growing darker each evening, its waves capped in white like the backs of restless horses. The air smelled of brine and wood smoke, and the bare branches in the garden scratched against the windows when the wind rose. Inside the attic nursery, Evelyn had begun to learn Oliver's rhythms, the way his eyes drooped after 2 stories, the particular hum that soothed him best, the way his hand searched instinctively for her sleeve when he woke from a bad dream. Jonathan at first kept his distance, but on the 4th night, when he came to check on Oliver after a late conference call, he stopped in the doorway instead of striding in. He hesitated, then knocked softly against the frame, a sound almost lost in the hush of the sleeping house. "May I?" he asked, his voice quieter than she'd yet heard it. She nodded. He stepped inside and stood watching as Oliver breathed evenly in Evelyn's arms, her chair creaking gently with the motion. His eyes lingered a moment longer, and though he said nothing, the look was different. Not the cool appraisal of an employer, but something more tentative, as if he were asking permission not just to enter the room, but to enter his son's world. On the 7th night, the storm came. It swept in off the ocean with a howl, lashing rain against the eaves and bending the maple in the garden nearly double. The power cut out just after 10, plunging the house into shadow, except for the dim glow of a single battery lantern Mrs. Clark set on the hallway table. Jonathan found Evelyn in the kitchen, with Oliver bundled in a blanket on her hip. She was rummaging in the pantry with a small flashlight, her voice calm and low to keep the boy from crying. "He needs warm milk," she said. "Electric kettle's out." Jonathan frowned, clearly unused to solving such practical problems without calling for staff. Evelyn moved past him to a lower cabinet, retrieving a battered camping stove, 2 burners, dented but functional. She set it on the counter and flicked it alight, the blue flame springing up like a small victory. "Gas burns no matter what the weather says," she told him, half smiling. He watched as she measured the water, explaining each step like a teacher guiding a nervous student. He followed her instructions, holding the bottle awkwardly in one hand and testing the temperature on his wrist when she told him to. Oliver's eyes, heavy with sleep, watched them both from the crook of Evelyn's arm. For a few minutes, the storm outside seemed to recede. It was only the three of them in that dim kitchen, the smell of warm milk in the air, the small sound of rain sliding down the windows. Jonathan's shoulders eased, and Evelyn thought that in that moment, this man, so at home in glass-walled boardrooms, looked almost like someone who could belong in a family picture. The following afternoon, with the storm past and the air washed clean, Evelyn was in the garden again. Duke stood near the stone wall, nose tilted toward the wind, ears shifting at every distant sound. His bandana was damp, but still neatly tied. She had begun to talk to him during her walks, telling him pieces of her day. He listened the way only dogs can, wholly, without interruption. Today she decided to ask about him. Not that she expected an answer, but because she had begun to suspect there was more to his story than the housekeeper had admitted. Her first lead came from the new groundskeeper, Michael Carter, a lean man in his early 40s with sun-browned skin and forearms crisscrossed by old scratches. His hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes had the cautious friendliness of someone who'd spent years working jobs where you had to prove yourself before being trusted. Michael was repairing a fence post near the side garden when Evelyn stopped to greet him. When she asked about Duke, he paused, resting one boot on the shovel's edge. "That dog's seen more fire than most firemen," he said. "Was part of the volunteer search and rescue upstate. There was a blaze at the Milford Animal Rescue Center. Bad one. Took out half the building before the trucks even got there. Duke went in twice, pulled out 3 animals before a beam came down. Lost his sight that night. They said he howled until they let him go back in, even blind." Evelyn glanced toward the shed. "And then he ended up here?" Michael shrugged. "Old handler moved away. Mr. Hayes offered to keep him on the property. Not sure why the shed's still locked up, though. Place has been empty as long as I've been here. Well, empty far as I know." His eyes flicked toward it, a subtle gesture, then back to his work. That evening, Evelyn noticed something new. The padlock on the shed door gleamed in the fading light, the metal too fresh compared to the weather-beaten boards around it. She was certain it hadn't been replaced before the storm. Duke was there again, standing with his nose almost touching the wood, tail still, as if waiting for something on the other side to move. When she called to him, he turned his head toward her voice, ears high, but made no move to leave his post. Inside the house, Oliver was in the attic nursery playing with wooden blocks. Jonathan knocked before entering, carrying a stack of papers, but setting them aside to sit on the floor with his son. Evelyn watched them from the rocking chair, noting the way Oliver leaned toward him now, without hesitation. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Jonathan caught her eye, and for once there was no guarded distance, just a quiet acknowledgement, like they were sharing the smallest of victories. Later, as she tucked Oliver into bed, Evelyn's thoughts kept circling back to the shed, the lock, and the silent dog who stood watch. She didn't know what was inside or why no one spoke of it, but she knew Duke hadn't forgotten. The following week dawned cold and bright, the kind of early winter morning when the frost still clung stubbornly to the garden grass until the sun had climbed halfway up the pale sky. The Atlantic shimmered in the distance, its steel-blue expanse dotted with the white sails of fishing boats returning from dawn runs. Evelyn was in the kitchen pouring coffee when Jonathan entered, dressed in a navy wool coat and carrying his leather briefcase. His hair was damp from the shower, and there was a sharpened energy in his step. "I'll be working from the study today," he said, his voice clipped but not unkind. "I'd like you to join me at 10. I'm presenting something new, and I want your perspective." When Evelyn entered the study later, she paused to take in the room, floor-to-ceiling windows letting in light over dark mahogany shelves, the faint scent of cedar and leather. Jonathan was at the desk, laptop open to a slide deck titled Harbor Light. "It's an application," he began, gesturing for her to sit. "For caregivers, nannies, single mothers, foster parents, a network for resources, quick contact with local aid, and vetted babysitting services." He explained the core features, his tone professional, yet tinged with a rare note of personal investment. Evelyn listened, leaning forward when he mentioned a community board function. "You need something else," she said finally. "A single-button emergency call, help now, that sends your location and a voice recording instantly. Some people can't type in a crisis." Jonathan's eyes flicked to hers, studying her. "That is a good point," he said slowly, typing the note. "Most of my team doesn't think like that." "Maybe they've never been the one holding the child," she replied softly. He didn't answer, but his expression told her the idea had landed. That afternoon, the sun hung low but bright, casting long shadows across the lawn. Evelyn had taken Oliver outside to play with a rubber ball when she saw a man she didn't recognize walking along the fence line. He wore a company jacket and carried a clipboard, his sandy hair sticking out from under a cap. His name tag read, "Terry Wallace, new hire, grounds maintenance." He smiled when he saw her, but something about his eyes, too quick, too assessing, put her on edge. "Cute kid," he said, stepping closer. "Mind if I—" He bent toward Oliver, holding out his arms as if to pick him up. Evelyn stiffened. "He's fine here," she said, moving subtly between them. Terry chuckled, an easy sound that didn't match the way his gaze lingered on the boy. "Just thought I'd show him the fish pond," he added. Before Evelyn could reply, a sharp, resonant bark split the air. Duke came bounding. Well, as close to bounding as his cautious, sightless gait allowed, from the far side of the yard, head low, teeth bared in warning. The sudden fierceness in the old dog's posture froze. Terry mid-step. Evelyn scooped Oliver into her arms, heart hammering. "I think you should check in with Mr. Hayes before taking anyone anywhere," she said firmly. Terry muttered something under his breath and backed off toward the tool shed near the drive. That night, after Oliver was asleep, Evelyn's curiosity about the locked shed returned in full force. She had noticed earlier that the storm-damp wood along its side had a loose panel. Slipping on a coat and scarf, she took a small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and crossed the moonlit lawn. Duke was there, as always, standing sentinel, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold. She knelt beside him, stroking the fur between his ears. "Keep watch for me," she whispered, not sure why she felt he would understand. The panel slid aside with little effort, revealing a narrow gap. She squeezed through, careful not to snag her coat, and found herself inside a small, dusty space that smelled faintly of charred wood and something older, paper perhaps. Against the far wall sat a weathered wooden chest, its brass latch tarnished. Evelyn flipped it open, coughing as a plume of dust rose. Inside, neatly stacked, were envelopes, receipts, and bound ledgers. The top folder was stamped with the logo of the Hayes Animal Relief Fund, a name she had never heard Jonathan mention. She sifted through them, eyes narrowing as she read donation records and grant letters. The last date before a sudden drop in activity was the same week as the Milford Animal Rescue fire, the one that had blinded Duke. After that, the entries shifted, large withdrawals marked only with vague codes, all signed off by someone named Richard Avery. She remembered the name from a framed photograph in the hall, Jonathan's longtime business partner. Her pulse quickened. She photographed several documents with her phone, careful to return everything exactly as she'd found it. As she eased back out of the panel, she caught sight of Duke's white bandana glowing faintly in the moonlight. He was sitting perfectly still, head turned toward the house, as if he sensed someone there. Evelyn followed his gaze and thought, for just a moment, she saw a shadow move past the far window of the garage. But when she blinked, it was gone. She told herself it was only her nerves. The next morning, Jonathan asked casually if she'd met all the new staff. She hesitated, then mentioned Terry Wallace. Jonathan frowned. "I don't recall approving another groundsman," he said. "I'll check with hiring." Evelyn decided, for now, not to mention the shed. There were too many questions, and too much she didn't yet understand. But one thing was certain. Whatever was in those papers, it wasn't meant to be forgotten. And Duke, for reasons she could only guess, had never left his post. By the time the next Atlantic storm rolled in, the air over the Maine coast had that thick electric weight that promised a long night of wind and rain. Gray clouds pressed low, and the scent of brine was heavy in the air. Inside the Hayes estate, the windows rattled softly, the fire in the living room snapping in protest at the drafts. Evelyn sat in the study, the folder of photographs and documents from the shed on her lap. Her heart beat faster as Jonathan entered, a steaming mug of coffee in one hand, his brow already furrowed in that familiar way that meant his mind was still tethered to business. "I have something," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. She slid the photographs across the desk. Jonathan picked one up, glancing at it casually, then stilled. His eyes scanned the signature line, the name Richard Avery in thick black ink. He looked up sharply. "Where did you get these?" "The locked shed," Evelyn answered. "You should know. Money from the Hayes Animal Relief Fund was withdrawn after the Milford fire. It's not in any public report." Jonathan's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening as he held the papers. "This is substantial," he muttered, almost to himself. "And damning." He set the photo down with deliberate care. "If this is true, someone has been bleeding the company dry under my nose." His gaze flicked back to her. "I need you to help me." They spoke for over an hour. Jonathan explained he would form a discreet internal group to audit accounts and interview staff without raising suspicion. "You'll be part of it," he said. "You see things others don't." Evelyn hesitated, feeling the weight of the trust he was placing in her. "All right," she agreed. "But you should know, someone might already be watching me." She told him about Terry Wallace, about the way Duke had bristled. Jonathan leaned back, eyes darkening. "Richard's people, most likely," he said grimly. That night, while Oliver slept, Evelyn went through more old files Jonathan provided. Among the scanned case reports from the Milford Animal Rescue fire, one name leapt out: Ethan Hayes, age 6 at the time, rescued by a German shepherd before fire crews arrived. She stared at the accompanying photo, a dark-haired boy clinging to the neck of a soot-covered dog. Even in the grainy image, she could see the familiar slope of Duke's ears, the faint streak of white across his chest. Her breath caught. The next morning, Evelyn found Jonathan in the conservatory, inspecting the storm shutters. She laid the report in front of him. "Your nephew," she said quietly. Jonathan frowned, scanning the page. His eyes lingered on the photograph, and something in his expression cracked. Part disbelief, part recognition. "That's Duke?" he whispered. "He saved Ethan?" Evelyn nodded. "And he's been here, in your yard, ever since, watching." Jonathan looked toward the back lawn, where Duke now lay in his usual spot, the white bandana stark against his dark coat. "I thought he just wandered here one day," he said, voice low. "I never realized—" The storm broke hard that afternoon, rain lashing sideways against the glass, wind howling through the eaves. Evelyn was in the kitchen warming milk for Oliver when she noticed movement at the far edge of the property. A man in a dark raincoat, hood up, was standing just beyond the fence. Even through the sheets of rain, she felt his gaze fixed on the house. She stepped toward the window, and he moved closer. Evelyn's pulse spiked. Then Duke was there, charging through the rain, barking with a ferocity she had not yet heard from him. His blind eyes seemed irrelevant. He moved with an unerring sense of where the threat stood. The man flinched back, slipping on the wet grass, before retreating quickly into the storm. Evelyn ran to the mudroom door, calling Duke in. The old shepherd shook himself once inside, sending droplets everywhere, before planting himself between her and the door, hackles still raised. She crouched down, running her hands over his damp fur. "Good boy," she whispered. When Jonathan returned later, soaked from checking the generator, she told him what happened. He listened, face hardening. "They're getting bolder," he said, "which means we're getting close." His voice was calm, but Evelyn could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he glanced toward the back door, as though expecting another shadow. The night ended with Oliver asleep between them on the couch, Duke lying at their feet, the storm raging outside. Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that the wind was carrying more than rain. It carried change, and the beginning of a fight they could no longer avoid. Morning came cold and clear after the storm, the sea outside the Hayes estate shining like sheets of glass under the early light. The wind had dropped to a faint whisper, and the smell of salt mingled with the sharp tang of pine drifting in from the hills. Inside the study, Jonathan stood with Evelyn beside the long mahogany table, Stacks of folders, USB drives, and signed affidavits spread before them. Their small, carefully assembled team, 3 trusted auditors, a legal advisor named Claire Morrison, and a retired police detective, sat in a half circle. Claire, a woman in her mid-40s with a sharp jawline, steel-gray bob, and a calm, commanding voice, carried herself like someone who had spent decades facing down boardrooms and courtrooms alike. "It's more than enough," she said, tapping a manicured finger against the top file. "We can move now." Jonathan nodded. "Then we move." His voice carried no hesitation. The plan unfolded quickly. Law enforcement would act on their tip, the board would be informed in an emergency session, and Richard Avery, once his father's closest friend, would be arrested before noon. Evelyn felt her pulse race, not from fear this time, but from the strange relief of knowing the truth was finally about to be dragged into the light. By midday, the news had broken. Officers in dark windbreakers escorted Richard Avery from the marble steps of Hayes Global's headquarters, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions over the clamor. Jonathan and Evelyn watched the live feed from the office television. Richard's expression was one of calculated calm, but his eyes darted toward the lens when a reporter mentioned the missing relief fund. Evelyn thought she saw the flicker of something, fear perhaps, or the moment he realized the game was over. That afternoon, Jonathan convened the board. The atmosphere was thick, defensive. Men and women in tailored suits sat rigid, glancing at one another instead of at him. He began by outlining the fraud, the misuse of funds, the betrayal of trust. Then, in a moment Evelyn didn't see coming, he turned the spotlight toward her. "Without Ms. Brooks," Jonathan said, voice carrying with a measured authority, "this company would still be bleeding in the dark. She risked her safety to bring us this evidence. From this day forward, she will serve as our community advisor for Harbor Light. Her insight is not only valued, it is vital." There was a beat of silence before one of the board members began to clap. Others joined, though a few did so with the stiffness of reluctant concession. Evelyn, flushed and startled, nodded her thanks, but her eyes met Jonathan's with a quiet understanding. This was his public promise to stand by her. Harbor Light launched the following month. The app's interface, streamlined with Evelyn's Help Now button and optional voice message feature, became an instant lifeline. In the first week, over 100. Emergency requests were answered. Mothers in unsafe situations connected to shelters within minutes. Caregivers matched with vetted volunteers overnight. Evelyn worked long hours, her desk now stacked with thank you letters from women whose lives had shifted in ways that were both small and monumental. With her new salary and a grant from the Harbor Light Initiative, Evelyn opened the Safe Harbor Center in a refurbished brick building downtown. The center smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint. The walls hung with children's drawings and photographs of Maine's rugged coastline. In the small courtyard, Duke had claimed his post near the gate. His blindness didn't slow him. He seemed to navigate by sound, scent, and instinct alone. Children adored him, especially after Evelyn sewed a dozen miniature white bandanas so each child could match him. He tolerated their gentle hands on his fur, the light tug of their tiny arms wrapping around his neck, and he would lift his head toward each giggle as though memorizing the sound. One afternoon, a young boy named Caleb, no older than 6, arrived at the center with his mother, who had escaped an abusive home that morning. Caleb was pale and withdrawn, clutching a stuffed bear so tightly the fabric was thinning. Duke approached slowly, head low, and nudged the bear once. Caleb blinked, then reached out and touched the shepherd's soft ear. By the end of the hour, Caleb was sitting cross-legged beside Duke in the sun, whispering to him in a voice so low Evelyn couldn't catch the words. She didn't need to. Duke's stillness was answer enough. Months passed, and the Hayes estate felt subtly changed. The sharp edges of Jonathan's manner had softened, Oliver's laughter now a daily soundtrack. Evelyn found herself lingering in the mornings, drawn to the simple comfort of coffee brewing, while sunlight spilled through the kitchen windows. On one such morning, she stood beside Jonathan at the counter, the rhythmic drip of the coffee maker filling the quiet. Oliver sat on the rug with Duke, holding up blocks for him to inspect, while the dog tilted his head, sniffing each one as though deciding which should pass some invisible quality test. Jonathan reached into a drawer and pulled out a small wooden plaque, setting it on the table. The letters were hand-carved, painted in soft blue. Home is where someone knocks. Anne stays. Evelyn traced the words with her fingertips, a warmth spreading in her chest that had nothing to do with the steaming mug beside her. She glanced at Jonathan, who gave a small, knowing smile. "You've earned that," he said simply. The day outside promised nothing more dramatic than sunlight and a light breeze. For Evelyn, that was enough. Oliver's laugh rang out as Duke barked once in gentle reply, the sound echoing through the open back door. It was the kind of morning she once thought only belonged to other people, the kind that made her realize. Sometimes staying meant fighting through storms, but it also meant choosing again and again to remain when the sun returned. In the quiet after every storm, there is a truth that feels almost like a miracle. Sometimes God sends his help, not in the form of grand visions or thundering voices, but through the gentle knock of someone willing to stay. Evelyn's journey, Duke's watchful heart, and Jonathan's change of spirit are reminders that the Lord's work is often carried out through ordinary hands with extraordinary love. In our everyday lives, we may be the answer to someone's prayer without even knowing it. A word of kindness, a moment of courage, a choice to protect the vulnerable. These are the small seeds from which God grows his greatest blessings. If this story touched your heart, share it so that others may be reminded of the quiet ways God works among us. Leave a comment and subscribe so you can join us in more stories of hope and redemption. And if you believe God still sends people and even animals to guard and guide us in his name, write amen in the comments, and may the Lord bless and protect you today and always.